Okay, so I'm serving as Dan this time, and I'll start with a brief introduction. Um, I'll try not to be too imitative because I think it's important to be myself when introducing these things. So we gather here around to read Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, partly out of my self-interest, as one of the topics that I'm interested in is Hegel, and one of the other topics that I'm in, we will be posing as sort of the central question by which to conduct this recording. I was speaking earlier and we were talking about the way to begin the session, and one of the things that came up was the nature of recording it. And I mentioned to those that were here that I couldn't tell whether I thought that we should record these sessions, and I couldn't tell whether that urge to record these sessions was some sort of self-interest that I was just sort of being precious and I wanted to hear myself speak a lot, or whether there was something urging me to record these sessions. That is, whether I was taking it upon myself to serve a self-interest or whether something was urging me to preserve it. Um, if that is the case, and if it is summoning us to partake in it and to preserve it, then I think that also through the act of recording it and through the act of participating in what it is, if it is something other than myself, we will be able to witness it and pay attention to it in a better way and perhaps clarify its nature. So the question that we gather around is one that came up in the previous series, but in a different context. And the framing that I'm going to give the question will itself prove antithetical to the previous context in which I think it was raised. So let me begin with the framing, and then I want to try and move on to show or give the peculiarity which makes it antithetical to the context in which we raised it. So the question that I think we should organize ourselves around is the question, can being be known? Now, we can ask what the significance of this question is. Why should we care whether being can be known? Is it something important? Who would have anything, or who could say anything to the contrary of the question? Um, the sort of knowability of being is important in philosophy because it sort of acts as a counterpoint to what is commonly thought of as a sort of skepticism. Skepticism sort of is that position that doubts that knowledge is possible, or that doubts that we can know truth, whatever those terms amount to. For some reason, perhaps the reasons which we shall see when we discuss the phenomenology, skepticism takes itself to find reasons within knowledge or the structures of knowing that make knowledge impossible. There's something that sort of undermines itself in the self activity that it takes part in. So, that is one, the context or the urgency of the question, can being be known? Is a sort of response to this attitude of distrust, and that that having it as a question and not seeking or not affirming that a response should be provided is important. We leave it open ended to see whether the skeptic has some justification for what they're saying, if that's possible to justify. We don't determine ahead of time whether being can be known. We just want to know. We want to inquire. We want to search into whether that is even a possibility, and if so, why it is. And here we come to the peculiarity of the framing of the question and why it's antithetical to the context in which I think it was raised in our previous sessions. So the framing is, can being be known? And this is antithetical to another context where this question is particularly modern. It asks not about the nature of the being known, but rather it asks about the status of knowing, its placement in relation to knowing. So amazing footage there. So it asks not about whether the question or the alternative framing that I want to suggest that is available, which is much more ancient and probably coheres more with the sort of Platonic texts that we've been reading over the past few sessions, is a slightly different question. And it's the question, is being knowable? Now, there's a slight difference between can being be known and is being knowable, although the two might turn out to be the same thing when we reflect on it properly and at the end of the inquiry. Is being knowable? That question asks not about whether this being can be grasped by knowledge, but rather whether it is the nature of the being to be something known. That is that being so constituted that it is knowable? And perhaps these two questions are, in a sense, two sides of the same coin. Can being be known is a question about is a question about capacities. It's a question about the possibility of knowledge and knowledge's relationship to some sort of thing, whereas is being knowable is a question about the being of something and its status as a knowable object. So what I want to suggest is that by plunging ourselves into the introduction of the phenomenology, we will come to better appreciate the question, its diversity, and perhaps even come to see that there is, or that there must be, a unity to the question that we seek. So that ends my rant, and I want to sort of open up for conversation, and perhaps we can begin the introduction with you guys' thoughts on the way I've introduced what we're doing.
Yo, I think that introduction was, yeah, brilliant. It feels auspicious and good, and appropriately reflective and reflexive. So it opens something. So we'll see where it goes. I hadn't, uh, I hadn't thought, because you've mentioned the framing question can being known before, but only when you were speaking now. I was wondering about the interchangeability of being and spirit. And I don't know if that's a nothing question or just I don't know if like a preference or, but it just occurred to me now. I wonder.
So to answer your question simply, I don't know. Perhaps there will be an interchangeability. As I said, I'm not qualified to sort of lecture on this, and I haven't really read past the introduction or the first chapter. So there might be an identity of spirit and being at some point in the text, I think. In the introduction, what we get is a sort of identification of the absolute with being. That's the first few sentences, depending on which translation you use. Um, Philosophy deals with the actual cognition of what truly is what Hegel says, and what truly is
Mm,
the absolute or being or whatever you want to term that.
uh,
And I think what we will perhaps watch develop is, or what we will come to see is that the the absolute either is some relation or is the relating or is in relation to whatever spirit is. If spirit, if are you taking spirit to be sort of the knower or the knowing, or what are you taking spirit to be, that you want to sort of posit this unity between the two?
um, it did just occur to me like in the um just as you were speaking, because I mean just because of the title. But if I were to give just my like intuitive image from the beginning in terms of what I've through osmosis gathered about this text and the thinker. I would assume it's something like what truly is being and its unchangingness, and then the relationship that it implies and our coming to relate with it or being related with it is the phenomena of spirit. So each time spirit solidifies a relationship with being, it's like an iteration. And that's something like the like stages of that iteration. So more to your question, I think, yeah, we are assuming the relatedness, and spirit is the manner of relatedness that comes to develop. Uh,
Sure. I think from what I've heard, that sounds like one position in the literature and around the text, that sort of being consecrates itself by being self-reflexively reflected in a sort of experiential nature. So it sort of reifies itself by having this recognition through spirit. Um, it's sort of a self-reflection upon itself, and that spirit is sort of the thing that recognizes it. But I think at this stage, at least in the text, I'm not sure that we should come to. I'm not sure whether we're at the position in the text to begin assuming. Um,
I'm happy to discard that image. Just what I've picked up. I'm happy to put it down. I'm here to put it down.
I don't think it's wrong or anything. I just think that what at least from how I understand the introduction to be working and why it's useful that we've sort of been pointed to an assumption is that one of the things we're trying to do when we do philosophy is sort of do a science without assumptions. We can't really take anything for granted when we do philosophy. If we want
Yeah.
truth, if we want certainty, if we want to know stuff, we can't take some knowledge and presuppose its validity, because as soon as we do, as soon as we say, I don't know, that natural science is valid and that we should use the laws of physics as our sort of standard to measure us, what we are coming to know, then that knowledge becomes the knowledge that's true, and philosophy becomes the sort of subordinate knowledge. Not only that, but to make matters worse for philosophy, if it does try to deal with and speak in truths and speak about truth, if something like natural science were above it, and that was the certification for philosophy, philosophy would rest on something that itself needs to be certified. So in another way to put it, in the example that I'm giving, what would justify the validity of natural science? Would it be, in this case,
Mm.
something else, or itself? And it seems like we have this infinite regress of assumptions that has to come to an end somewhere. And I'm suggesting that philosophy itself is where that comes to an end, or where it should come to an end. If we want to come to know being and talk about truth and all these things, what I think is going on at the beginning here is the sort of either trying to find a criterion or trying to find out how we can proceed without a criterion.
Yeah. Yeah, that's that. I'm hearing that uneasiness that he mentions in that first, like in the first paragraph, sort of uneasiness.
Yeah. So one of the
Um,
ways into this, I think, is to notice that philosophy deals with the absolute and then has this character that it needs to be assumptionless, and then to notice that isn't Hegel assuming something? He's saying it's a natural assumption that in philosophy, before we start to deal with the proper subject matter, the absolute knowledge of what truly is, one must first come to an understanding about knowledge, which is either regarded as an instrument or a medium to get hold of the absolute, whatever he calls it. Isn't that itself, are we, is Hegel doing something contrary to what I want to posit as philosophy? Because I'm not sure we all are agreeing on this yet.
I might have misunderstood. I might have misunderstood in the beginning, but I thought it brings up the assumption only to doubt if the assumption is valid. I don't know, maybe I misread it. So I don't know if he's assuming it's how we should start, or he's bringing up the assumption to doubt the assumption itself.
Yeah, so that's again what I wanted to maybe point to. So it looks maybe from the outside like he's assuming something, but if he's assuming something in order to dispel it, he can't really assume that it's wrong. He has to sort of somehow take the assumption, and he notices that it's even natural. There's something that appears right about this assumption, but that what we're doing is sort of getting rid of an assumption. And so we have a sort of an assumptionless assumption. We have a sort of way to get to an assumptionless science, and that's not by assuming anything, but by removing, or by the removal of assumptions.
Yeah. And that process, that's the phenomenology. That's what he's, and again, I don't know whether I should stop pulling from what I've accumulated, but that's historicized for him. Like it's, so we,
So again, I want to try and avoid being a tyrant or a lecturer or someone else, but
yeah,
because I haven't read this text either fully, so I don't know. I assume that what's
no,
going on is sort of a self-unfolding,
we're
but
using you. Yeah,
that's fine. The historicism, I guess it depends what you mean by the historicism. Do you mean by empirically there's a track or a history that comes with philosophy, and this is what was going on around the time? So he sees these people doing this sort of philosophizing, this assuming that before we come to know the stuff we need to know about knowing, and then he goes, this stuff's been happening, so that's what we need to do. Is it a response to the context? Is the historicizing that empirical arbitrary series of like cause and effect, or is it rather this is the naturalness that's so peculiar in the assumption that he's talking about? Right at the beginning, he says it's a natural assumption in philosophy to deal with this. Now, is the naturality and the historicity of the assumption that it has come to be, and that Hegel's the first one noticing this weird progression in this chain of events? Is he reflecting on this sort of empirical experience and going, these guys have been doing it, so this is what philosophy does? Or is it an unfolding of the nature of being or philosophy itself? Is there sort of a guiding tendency that is historicized by being what it should be?
let me from the bottom of the first page, the
Yeah.
okay. But this improvement would in fact only bring us back to where we were before. If we remove from a reshaped thing what the instrument has done to it, then the thing, here the absolute, becomes for us exactly what it was before this, accordingly superfluous effort. So if the sense that it's this unfolding relationship with the absolute, then there's that, and then the manner of trying to relate to it is this manner of adopting natural assumption. And the natural assumption of philosophy is that we first have to understand the means by which we cognize the absolute. or that we know. So we have to understand knowledge before we can understand the absolute. Then he's like, okay, knowledge is either medium or instrument. He was talking here about the instrument. So this line got me in particular. Like, if we remove from a reshaped thing what the instrument has done to it, so if we're assuming that knowledge is like an instrument, then the thing, the absolute, becomes for us exactly what it was before this superfluous effort. So I think I'm pressing into like it does being change or um ah,
It sounds like I don't know. It sounds like our relationship with it is the thing that changes. I don't know. Maybe I'm misunderstanding you now. It sounds like what changes is our relationship with it instead of it. If you're basing the change of being on the statement you just made, isn't us removing the effects of the instrument, if the instrument is not part of being, is not part of being our relation to being changed, makes sense. That even makes sense. I don't know, was I clear enough?
Yeah. It's it's the peculiarity of that, and like what, and so I think what I meant by the historicized is that this relationship has like certain concrete historical achievements in terms of how it's been configured, or how it's been so. So I think what Hadley was bringing up and what he brings up here is this: he's desiring to find science. So he's saying like science has just come on the scene when he's writing this. It's like just come on the scene. But even that wording is like it's come on the scene. That means it wasn't here before. And he's like what he's pursuing is the like the perfection of science. And that would have to do with its relatedness to being somehow. So then but the intuition that I had in terms of what I've accumulated about the text was that we begin to approach that by reflecting on the way in which this relatedness to being has historically unfolded. And so like we come to like unconceal that the phenomenology of it. But let me stop there before I
How is that?
ruin whatever I said.
No. I think what you said is great. I just want to ask the question of, if we are to approach being by history, how does that not just make the job of the philosopher the job of the historian? Isn't the historian someone who goes back and studies the concrete facts that have come into being, and then by tracing their lineage comes to a sort of better understanding of the unfolding that is? And if
Yeah.
that's the case, what's the job of the philosopher? How is the job of the philosopher different from the job of the historian, say?
I think it has to do with the what is concrete. So it seems that there's something that the philosopher's own being has to be recovered in some kind of way through those inheritances. But those inheritances are like are a historical fact that are reposited, or like repositories in the being, in one's being, that figure one's relationship to being. And so like yeah, I guess that's what I feel the answer might be in terms of history. So historian might be like what are the written documents I can get about when Napoleon went nuts, and then try and write about events in that way. This seems like a different project.
Sure. Okay. I can see the distinction that you're drawing there. Cool. I just wanted to make sure that we're not conflating the two, because I think it's important, and I
Yeah.
think that there might be a reading of Hegel. I have no idea because I haven't read the secondary literature that takes him to be a sort of empiricist, that takes him to be doing sort of the philosophy that he's doing, to be a sort of collection of facts. He seems to be in one way doing something like that when he begins with a natural assumption. He's picking up on something that there's literary evidence for prior to him, and in that way he can pick up on this tendency and notice it. But I think what he's doing might be more peculiar and more interesting than that for several reasons. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is maybe we should stick with the example. Maybe we should get to that reshaping that you want to talk about, and the starting there again. This is why when we first started, I said sometimes Dan said that he hadn't finished the reading the second or third time that he did it. And I said that sometimes it's not so important to finish the reading. And I think this is precisely why. And it's the peculiar nature of this text that when we try to jump ahead, it starts to disassemble itself. When we try to impose something from the outside, the flow of the text is somehow interrupted and doesn't let itself come to be. It's I think we're struggling to make a beginning because we're not beginning with it, with the material in front of us. And perhaps
Ah,
when we come to see why this reconfiguring of the representation, when we let go of the instrument, when we have this instrument which is knowing, and we try to take the knowing away from being, we end up with just what it was before. Why that's even a problem. So let's visit the assumption. Why
yeah.
what justifies the assumption that we should know our knowing prior to knowing being? Like, isn't that antithetical to all the ancient sort of stuff we've been reading? Don't they just sort of start off with some form of source or some sort of nature and then derive some of those things from that? Or, you know, isn't there a type of philosophy that
Yeah.
claims to know the nature of being and then work from that nature of being down to the particular things known? Why should we have to know our knowing before we know being?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
did
So
say it was okay. Off you go then.
no, go for it.
I'm trying not to go for it. Okay, I suppose I can't hide behind a rock forever. How do I put this? You did say it's quite a sort of modern line of thought question. Look, maybe I have not touched any secondary sources. I've not done any research. I don't know anything except what the text is saying, and I'm leaning into sort of a little intuition. Yeah. So I want to say that skepticism or the doubt that comes up in the text is very interesting for me. Right? And it's very interesting for me because Hegel wants us to question our knowing. Right? It's like he is purposely distinguishing himself from the knowledge prior. We've already spoken about. He's distinguishing himself from the knowledge prior. Right? And he's distinguishing himself from the knowledge prior because of the assumptions. I feel like I'm just parroting you guys because of the assumptions in it, right? So questioning whether or not we know the absolute and whether our knowing is knowing, how we come to that knowing, whether we're using the right form of knowing in relation to the absolute. All these questions are sort of a turn away from, I'm just going to say, the classics, good old, right? And it's a turn that had already been happening, I wanted to say, before Hegel. So Hegel is moving in the spirit of his time and saying, but wait a minute, we don't know this thing because everybody is starting to realize that we know very little. We're trying to create new things. We are at war with tradition. We want to have knowledge for ourselves, in a sense. We're trying to contradistinct. Yeah, we're trying to be distinct, in a sense, and not inherit knowledge that we have no foundation. And we want to create new things because these things seem somewhat harmful. I want to say he's doing that because he's walking along that path. I may be absolutely wrong. I'm happy to.
Is he not maybe sort of walking in that path and noticing that it sort of loops in on itself? The natural assumption that he addresses is that we need to come to know our knowing. And you said that the sort of assumption that moves away from the sort of classical tradition is already there prior to Hegel, this need to produce everything out of oneself. Perhaps Descartes or Kant would help as exemplars of this sort of the skepticism or this doubting, this need to question everything that came before, to not take up the sort of story of tradition, to not accept those traditional values, and to sort of question everything for oneself, to come to see whether there is anything that we can know once and for all. One can think of the beginning of the meditations, where Descartes' meditated begins with the sort of traditional knowledges and then starts to question those. The sense knowledge is sort of one that seems primary in both the genetic way, but also in a sort of societal way. There seems to be a sort of tradition of taking sense knowing as the knowing that is immediately true. And by questioning that, Descartes, at least, is embarking on this quest of doubt. But it seems what Hegel is doing is going, yeah, there's something to that. It's a natural assumption. The assumption is not just an assumption. This naturalness, I think, is important. It seems justified, and you gave part of the reason why it seems justified. The two arguments that he gives for why this view is justified, why we should turn to know our knowing before we can know being, is there's a sort of means end argument. That if knowing, so he first identifies that philosophies presuppose that knowing is either an instrument or a medium. And then in the case of an instrument, if we use the wrong instrument for the end we want to achieve, we might turn out to undermine that very end. So, I don't know, I can't think of a good example. If we try to use a wine glass to hammer a nail, we might undermine the very act that we're trying to do because the wine glass will break before it manages to push a nail into wood. We use a mean that undermines its own end. So too in the case of knowing being. If knowledge is an instrument for grasping being, and there are different types of knowing, different types of cognition, I think is this term, imagination, understanding, intuition, all of these sort of Kantian heritages that he brings along with him. Couldn't it be that we use the wrong means to get at being? If being is not knowable through concepts, then we try to know it through concepts. We just fail immediately. So instead of trying to know being as it is, we need to come to know our knowing prior to knowing being. Or so it seems. The other thing that he brings up is, before you go down, is that if knowing is, again, this all depends on if there are different types of knowing, or if knowledge is something definite, then without a precise definition of what knowledge is and the scope of knowledge, we don't really know whether it can apply to being, whether knowledge extends to being. We have no idea of what knowledge actually can grasp, or what's within the range of knowability. And so he seems to bring up these 2 points that sort of reinforce what makes this uneasiness that people like, I think, Descartes and Kant exemplify, appear justified. Now we get to go Sipho.
Can we take a step backwards? I might have missed a step here. Does he clarify in any sense what is meant by one being? And if he has some clarity on what he means by knowing, or is part of what he's doing trying to emphasize that we don't even know what those things are, and we need to know what those things are before we know those things. Or rather, knowing what those things are and knowing those things is the same thing. Can you guys help me with that a little bit? Because everything seems to be running in circles when we use being and the knower and being running in circles.
So he definitely characterizes knowing either as an instrument or as a medium. And he characterizes that knowing is either an instrument or a medium for grasping being. That's what it's been taken to be historically, under this assumption. Whether or not that's worthwhile or worth considering is itself a question. We might come to see why that's more appropriate. The question of whether he defines being is difficult. I don't really see one before he comes to say that we need to doubt knowing, but perhaps that's because it's almost taken for granted that being is something, and that we need to know this something to do philosophy. That there's this tendency in philosophy to also know what being is. But I think that the worry that you're coming to, the worry of this clarity, this indistinctness that's coming up between knowing and being, is one that he will address slightly later in the text. Where is this? It's numbered 75 in this version of the text. I'm not sure where it is in your text. He talks about this conclusion stems from the fact that the absolute alone is true, or the truth alone is absolute. One may set this aside on the grounds that there is a type of cognition which, though it does not cognize the absolute as science aims to, is still true, and that cognition in general, though being capable of grasping the absolute, is still capable of grasping other kinds of truth. But we gradually come to see that this kind of talk, which goes back and forth, only leads to a hazy distinction between an absolute truth and some other kind of truth, and that words like absolute, cognition, etc., presuppose a meaning which has yet to be ascertained. So we're at the beginning of philosophy. We're trying to begin. We're trying to figure out whether being is knowable. We're trying to figure out whether this project can be done. And so, in a sense, there's been a tendency to try and do this project in either one of two ways, either by beginning from being, which is, I guess, ontology. Ontology begins from being and then moves down. And then there's the sort of epistemology, which is the sort of Kant and Descartes, which starts from knowing and then tries to work up towards being. What Hegel's doing is noticing that these two sort of come undone or come together. I don't know in one sort of way, but that as soon as we try to distinguish them, or as soon as we try to begin this thing, we get caught in this issue. And the issue that we get caught in is we can't really define knowing without defining being, and we can't really define being without defining knowing.
That's what's tripping me up. It seems the thing that ties the two is this emphasis on truth. This emphasis on truth. I don't know whether it's because it's absolute or anything. In other words, it seems that knowing being, right? Knowing being is knowing a truth. It's not an absolute truth. And then it also seems like knowing your knowing requires you to know truth, which in a way it kind of seems to suggest that in order for us to know our knowing, we need to already know being. I don't know if I'm the only one who's falling into that. It seems like I don't know how you're going to get truth without knowing being. And I don't know how you're going to get knowing without knowing truth. That's the circle. Like,
but why should we assume? Why should we assume that we get truth or being? Why assume those things at the outset?
Because if I don't know if I'm assuming it, but if we're getting being, right? If we're getting being, then we truly getting being. And so we're getting a truth, the truth of being. Right? But that seems to suggest we need to be capable of getting truth. And that's why we need to know. That's why the knowing is important. We need to know that we actually know we're getting truth, right? But truth is also a type of being, right? If I'm making sense, I'm not saying truth is being in this sense, but truth is a type of being, and it seems that type of being, it seems that we are assuming the existence of that type of being if we don't know that being. I don't know if that point I'm making is making sense. Since wherever we start, we have to assume wherever we start.
Yeah, we seem to be. You're saying that truth is itself a sort of entity, right? Truth has a being, and that knowing, and that in some sense, knowing truth or trying to figure out whether we can get to truth is in a sense investigating a sort of being that already is. I think that's where we get to. I think that's precisely what Hegel is trying to point to. And I think that he's trying to point to it by showing that the separation between knowing and being, or this attempt to separate knowing and being, that has been going on in philosophy, even though it appears justified, can't really be justified, because when we look at it, once we separate knowing from being, that's why this conclusion stems from the fact that the absolute truth is true, or the truth alone is absolute. Once we separate the two, we get a knowing that is true and yet is somehow excluded from being that which is. And so, in a sense, that knowing is not. That's one way, I guess, of formulating the issue.
Yeah, I think you basically captured it better than I was trying to express it. Yeah, and now the thing that puzzles me, I don't know if he's doing it on purpose, like you guys are saying, or not. Now, the thing that puzzles me is him saying these things seem to suggest, seems to in themselves suggest truth. Like him saying these things about ontology and epistemology seem themselves to reaffirm. I don't know, maybe I'm thinking into it too much, but when he talks, when he mentions these points, that okay, they come apart, and there's this, and there's this, and there's this. What he's saying seems true, you know what I mean? It seems to once again suggest, yep, it is true, and it is. But there's something, I don't know what it is. There's something that my skepticism is kicking in. Like I'm getting a this fuckery of foot feeling, and I don't know how to describe, and I don't know how to describe why. Because it seems like he's right. It seems like he's right. Anyway, maybe I'm jumping the gun. Carry on.
No, I think what you're doing is interesting. I'm trying not to predispose this to a particular interpretation or anything like that. I think yeah. What do we do once he seems to be right? What do we do once we get to the knowing and being must be the same thing? Sure, like we've said that they can't come apart. We said that they can't be separate, right? And we've given these sort of reasons why they can't be separate. We've done that. That's the negative work. How do we show that they aren't separate? What's the doing that has to be done? The work of philosophy is. It seems like we've just we've just begun, and we're already at the end.
That's the feeling. It's like he's confirmed it by doing it. So I'm like, okay, so what are we doing? You know what I mean? So, what are we doing there?
You said something that's interesting there, that he's confirmed it by doing it. And I think what you're noticing and what Hegel is asking us to pay attention to, especially once we see that the separating of being and knowing is inappropriate, is to notice that something comes on the scene, I think is his term. Something appears. There's this appearance of a knowledge that is unified with being. Or there's this appearance of something comes to be. And I think this is why I wanted to avoid Dan's reading of the Phenomenology of Spirit earlier. That phenomenology, I think, the phenomena that we are studying is the coming to be of that unity between being and knowing. Or another way to put it, the activity that we're doing in doing the Phenomenology of Spirit is a reuniting of being with knowing. He's giving us a third way of knowledge. I don't know how to pass this on. I don't know how to say this.
I also want to say, please phrase it another way.
We've got these definitions of knowing as instrumental, which is it acts on something and a means and end sort of relationship, and then it acts on this thing, and then the thing isn't what it is anymore because it shapes it. Even if we take it away, then the thing just turns back into what it was, and it's no more closer to us. It's like we take the fish out of water with a rod, and we bring it close to us, but then it's not a fish anymore because it's not alive and in its environment and interacting with other fish in the way that it's supposed to be. But we want to get closer to this thing, so we let it go. We take the rod away, but it's just now either lying there on the floor dead in front of us, and then it's no more a fish than what it was, or we let it go into the water, and then we can't follow it anymore because it's not with us anymore, right? The instrument has this weird thing where it shapes the thing, and then as soon as we let go of the instrument, we don't have the thing anymore. We're no longer with the thing in itself. It's not itself anymore. It's either for us or it turns into something that it was before, that we're no closer to it. Similar problem with thinking as a medium, the mirror image of thinking, which is interesting to challenge because it's Plato's account of thinking, I would imagine. This imitative, reflective nature of truth of knowing as a medium through which truth passes or through which being is in a relationship to. When we get that, for Hegel at least, we never get to the in itself. What we get is a sort of pale reflection of the thing in itself. The reflection is not the thing in itself, it's just a reflection. And so in accessing the medium, we get a reflection. And to make matters worse, even if we know the laws of refraction, even if we know how the light bounces off the medium, we can't trace the thing back from that. We can just see where the thing should be. Think about it, like we're in a house of mirrors, right? And being is this thing being imaged. We know how the mirrors reflect light. We know the angles of their reflection. We can point and go, the reflection must be coming from there. But that pointing isn't the thing. It's just a pointing. It's a pure direction. That's, I think, his term for it. So in both of those weird ways of knowing, or both of those weird ways of knowing our knowing or thinking about our knowing, what knowing fails to do is to think being, or what knowing fails to do is to be. That's the absurdity. In failing to grasp the thing in itself, knowledge fails to be what it's supposed to be, and in some ways, it then is not.
Then is the fuckery kicking in again. It's the way it comes to it's when it comes to it being not that I'm like, no. Something went wrong, something went wrong now. It's right here. That's the point that's itchy.
That's the thing. Those two are the things that are wrong, right? That's the picture that's wrong. The fact that knowing becomes something that is not, and yet is because we're doing it or attempting to do it, is wrong, and it should be wrong, because how can it not be if we're doing it?
Yet people have been doing it.
If it's actual, it must be possible. But what we've shown is that in either of those cases, in either of the cases that we've chosen to do philosophy from, either as ontology or epistemology, all these historical philosophers, the people that we used to look up to, they've all been, according to Hegel at least, or according to some interpretation of Hegel that I'm developing here, they've all been developing a sort of knowing that is not, or a knowledge that is true without grasping being. It's that unity problem that we came to at the beginning with the is being knowable or can being be known. To ask the question either way is to remove yourself from that third possibility. And that third possibility is what I want to suggest that he's proposing, that we're going to develop. And what we're going to develop through doing the phenomenology of spirit is a sort of being that is as much of a knowing as it is a being, or a knowing that is as much of a being as it is
of a knowing.
Good question. Yeah.
This is why I struggle with the text also, Vida, before you do your question.
I don't even know how to say the question, just discombobulated. Yeah. Okay. This is the looping in on itself. All right. I think the question is gone. I think the question is gone. I think the question is gone. I think I am realizing I'm having a moment. We aren't sure about this thing that we keep using. We aren't sure about the things that we know from this thing we've been using. We can't not have things that we know. We must know something in order to press towards any knowing, which means we must use this thing that we don't know anything about. Let's just use the thing and see how it goes.
Yeah, in some sense, that's his whole. I think that's his whole spiel about the fear of falling into error that he goes into. I think it's on point 74 or something like that. He talks about these people that want to know knowing before they know being, and he says that if the fear of falling into error sets up a mistrust of science, which in the absence of such scruples gets on with the work itself and actually knows something, it's hard to see why we should not turn around and mistrust this very mistrust. Should we not be concerned whether this fear of error is not just the error itself? In fact, it turns out that this being scared of making a mistake takes a lot for granted. It takes what we've just been talking about. This object on one hand and this knowing on the other hand, that separates the two. It presupposes this sort of separation. So I think what your question was pointing to and what we have to do is to just do the work that is the phenomenology of spirit. This thing that's been along with us all along is now we've taken out the impedances to its functioning. We've let it be, and now the job is to not be scared, which takes a lot of courage. It's asking a lot of us, because now after this, I don't know much more. And so what I'm asking you guys to open yourselves up to, and myself to open myself up to, is the possibility of the very hard work That's just trying to know and seeing whether in trying to know we come to know being. I don't know if we will. It seems like we should, but at this point in the being of knowing, even though it's appeared, it's just an appearance. It is not. What we're investigating is its appearance. It's come onto the scene. It has no more justification than the other view. All it has is that the other view also seems incorrect. And so to appeal to either one of them is just as almost as useless as the other. So the hard work that's being asked and the hard work that is philosophy is just getting on with it. Just seeing what pops up and investigating that popping up and then seeing if that popping up stands to the test. In a way, it's quite similar to Platonic dialogue.
I was about to say, it seems to be going straight back to the thing is shooting down. Because it seems like in the past, that's what they just did. They just went on with it. They just took an assumption like, let's go from there.
Yeah, I think there's a way in which Hegel seems to be shooting down Plato in terms of in terms of denying that knowing is a medium. But in another way, there's a Platonic response to Hegel. Plato never claims to know being.
In fact, he's emphatic about it not being known.
Yeah.
Yeah, he seems to be emphatic about that point. Right? We just can't know it.
That's one of the problems, I think. So that's something to keep in mind. A sort of Platonic response to Hegel might be available and might be interesting, but I think we need to. I think we're at least us as a group, the four of us, are familiar with that Platonic position. The four of us are unfamiliar with the Hegelian position. So to make that criticism is something that we can't do until we've seen it. You know. To see whether the alternative that he's proposing, that this desire of getting to being that he has, whether it's possible or not. Because if it is, then perhaps that is itself a sort of way of overcoming that emphatic disavowal of the knowledge of being. That
knowing being. It seemed.
Yeah, go Sipho.
To take an epistemic root of epistemology, it seems very similar, if not even the same as asking the question of epistemological question where we work with perception of object. In other words, like we can't get to the object because we use tools that are perception of the object, and all we ever get are what we perceive instead of the object itself. And I don't know if I'm understanding Hegel in this way, but I think what he's saying, and if it is what he's saying, I will agree with him. It seems the direction he's going, I'm not saying it's what he's saying, but it seems the direction seems to be suggesting is that, well, what if the perception of being which we receive is part of being itself, and part of being is that we have to perceive it the way we do. So let's just pursue being and not worry about getting to it without the perception.
Yeah, there's this thing. There's sort of like the versions of the response to the epistemological problem. That sort of perceptual problem is that we have sort of representations, and our representations of the object can't match the object because they're ours. So it's that perceptual tools aren't adequate for that being. And for someone like Descartes, he says that can be overcome, and that can be overcome by appealing to something like God or that thing which sort of connects our perceptions and being, or is that connection. Whereas Kant has a sort of slightly different approach to the problem. Kant sort of is the counterpoint to Descartes. It can't be solved. All we ever get are our perceptions. So what we should focus on knowing is not being, which is external. The thing in itself is unknowable, and it's its nature to be unknowable. What we should know is the appearances, the phenomena. That's the Kantian turn, is to disavow that sort of being. By letting it be what it is in itself, we don't know it. It just is. That's why the weird Kantian contradiction that the thing in itself exists is one that's, it's maybe my favorite contradiction in philosophy, because it lets being be what it is. It's just we don't know it. It's that which is unknowable. But
we
Hegel,
only know our relation to it.
Yeah, but Hegel seems to be doing what you're doing, and Hegel seems to be the way that why I wanted to reframe it is because if we have the three formulations of this problem, it could be useful. So Descartes is sort of, there is a problem, but it can be overcome. Kant says there is a problem and it can't be overcome. Hegel's is there seems to be a problem, but the problem is not really a problem.
Problem, yeah. Seems there is no real problem.
Yeah.
It's just a perception.
The nature of being is to sort of bring into being a being that perceives it.
Yeah. I'm of the three, I'm convinced by Hegel, right? Or maybe I'm biased to that perspective. I don't.
And then it's that sort of self-reflection that's happening. That sort of being reflects on itself and comes into reify itself by being recognized as what it is.
What are the thinking or accepting this approach instead of the other approaches? I'm wondering what are the outcomes? What are the possible outcomes for taking one path instead of the other paths? If even it looks different, if it does look different, how does it look different? Because surely it will have. That's the crazy thing about metaphysics in general. It seems removed from everyday life, but I would argue it has the largest implications in everyday life because it's going to now affect how you interact with everything. So the implications of this, yeah, bro, like, fuck, I'm in a position where Hegel doesn't even need to convince me. I'm like, yeah, well, fuck, I kind of agree with you. I kind of agree with you, but let's see what the rest of his things, where the rest of his thing goes.
Well, I think
that contradiction you like, I can see why you like it. I can see why you like it. See why you like
it. Let's take like 1,000 steps back. I'm struggling with the separation between knowing and being.
Same.
I don't know exactly why I am, from as much as I gathered between my own ramblings in my head. You seemed happy to suggest that the separation is unjustified. Right.
Yeah.
I'm having a hard time with.
I said that
I'm
the
having
is justified. It turns out to be unjustified.
Can you repeat that?
I said that it appears justified. It's a natural tendency to posit the separation. There appear to be good reasons for it, but when we look at those reasons in detail, they turn out to not be reasons for it at all. But why are you struggling with why are you struggling with it, and what is it that you're struggling with?
Look, I see Hegel in a way doing the same thing. The whole journey he takes us on is one where you are using knowing in some sense to press towards something. Something is falling away. There is a return. There is a change in you, the experience, which is unfolding over time, which is a little bit of dance, historicizing, right? There's something that's happening with your motion through something to get to an idea of the absolute. While we're doing that, we are using the very same knowing in a way that presses us towards the thing. If the knowing and the being were together, right? It's okay. It looks like we're already there, as you guys have said. So it looks like the knowing and the being are coming together, but we're using it in a way that's separate. To go to the thing, to understand the thing in order to understand this thing. Everything is happening at once.
Yeah, so you're pointing out a sort of counter argument to the one that I gave to Sipho earlier. The what work do we need to do? Like now that we've begun, what is there left to do? You're saying that by doing something, we must be doing something wrong because the doing is itself a sort of separation. Why should we have to get back to being if being and knowing are already in a sense one? Right? Am I understanding you correctly? The activity, this turning, that using of knowing is itself a sort of separating of being and knowing, or presupposes
Yes.
the disavow.
Yes.
I think
So
that's what Dan's question was so interesting earlier about the section that he points out where I don't remember. I think he talks about the bird on the twig, um, and with the activity of pretending to do stuff, we end up undermining ourselves. I can't remember if the absolute was not with us in and for itself all along. Surely our activity would make us laugh a ruse or something. I can't remember the text. It's in front of me, but I don't want to look at it right now. And I think what he's pointing to is so this being, this thing, another way of passing out this problem. There's the same problem passed out in I don't know how many ways in this beginning section, is in sort of Kantian terms, and that's the sort of language of mediation and immediacy. So mediation is where something undergoes a process. So like images are mediated. I see an object and my eye does something to that thing, and then the perception that is an image is a mediated representation of something. So it goes through a process to come to be in my mind. But there's also this sort of an immediacy. The thing that my eye represents is itself a thing, and so is immediately, with whether I see it or not. It has a for itselfness. It exists for itself. And so there's a sort of immediacy to this thing. And whether we're talking about the first principle or the being or the knowing or whatever it is, there seems to be this issue of what we are trying to know is being, and being needs to in some way be immediate. But by trying to know it, we're trying to mediate it. We're trying to use some process to get to it. And so, I don't know, I think this is in the science of logic or something, but he says that there's nothing in heaven or on earth that's either without mediation or immediacy. And I think this is where he comes up with this weird idea of a mediated immediacy. Somehow, it's the same talk about the assumptions that we were having earlier. He's not assuming something, and we're not doing something. We're undoing something or unraveling something. We are not working towards being, but being is pulling us up in towards itself by sort of undoing the shackles that tie us down apart from it, or appear to tie us down apart from it.
Okay. One small question. Sorry, Dan. Am I not? What work is there left to do but an internal consciousness? Is that the whole thing?
I guess so, but in that there's that one side where it's an internal switch of consciousness. But in that one side, that consciousness, it's important to note that there's two sides to it. There's that consciousness coming to recognize itself or turning towards itself, But in turning towards itself, it also is more. It becomes what it truly is by looking to itself. It sort of is. I don't know how else to say it.
Mediated immediacy. Jokes.
Dan, I don't know if I answered your question sufficiently, Avida.
More confusion, but thank you.
I've had feelings of that era, but this might go in a. Let me just put something down. So we're doing philosophy. That means we're wanting to come to the actual cognition of what truly is. That's our goal. Okay. Then the one, okay, subject, object, means of knowing, and he differentiates means, this instrumental medium, and between these two, somehow that structure is what it's a mediated immediacy eternally. It's always there somehow. We can't get the one without the other. It's
I hesitate.
all the thing.
I hesitate. It's difficult to see that subject-object means the mediation that we're using to get there. When you talked about means earlier, he has this weird throwaway line. I can't remember where it is. Where is this? It's an important.
It might be.
Yeah.
I've heard there, but cognition might be the word in there for the means. But
yeah. So cognition is, I take it, again, I'm sure there's vast disagreement about what the term means. I take it to be knowing. Cognition is knowing.
yeah.
But I think sometimes people prefer it to be mental representations or mentations or activities of the mind, different faculties, exercises. I don't know. Pick your poison. But
yeah.
At the bottom of 73, right towards the end, when he talks about the means which immediately brings about the opposite of its end. 73, the numbering, not the page. He says, either way, which means either way of knowing as an instrument or reflection, we make use of a means which immediately brings about the opposite of its own end. We try to do something and that somehow undermines itself. Or rather, what is really absurd is that we should make use of a means at all. This idea that we need to mediate, this idea that there is this mediation seems to be the issue, because if it's the immediate, then the mediation is unnecessary. We don't need to do it. It seems like there's this struggle between this bringing together of subject and object through this medium of knowing. As soon as we start separating and passing out the terms in that way, we seem to fall prey to the same problem, but also we seem to be doing the sort of project that Hegel is doing. I'm not sure how, and I think one of the things that we shall be trying to figure out by doing this text more and discussing it more is how or in what way is it different? Because he seems to have a unity of subject and object, but in so having one, he also seems to have a disunity.
Yeah. Okay. So again, I'm working a lot just in images, like that the cognition that brings about an end that is opposed to the intent with which it's used is not the cognition that we want to be talking about or involving ourselves in. But our goal is to have the cognition of the actual cognition of what truly is. So we're looking for, in that sense, the proper means by that's like we're looking for that. And we have to go by means in order to do that, because it's always the three together, the subject, object, and the means. The way to then that sense of that I don't want to reach too much into like an image, but we've used language like recover or uncover or something like there's a sense of a development that means has constituted itself to imply what the subject and object are, and then that relationship has developed, and there's been a change in means. It seems like that's where
there's that developmental thing that you're bringing up that I think is important. And I said we shouldn't read the preface, and I don't want to, but there's a lot of developmental imagery in the preface. He talks about how philosophical systems appear to contradict one another, and sort of to the untrained eye, the blossoming of a bud from a seed seems to contradict the germinal phase of the plant. This coming forward of this new thing replaces this old thing. And it seems to be something different. But when we really look at it in the context of the whole that is the life of the plant, its end brings about, it's sort of a self-reproduction. It's this sort of life, it's the life cycle of the whole. And so I think in your usage of the language of recovery is it's a separation of the being from the knowing. And it's this recovering that I'm not sure whether it is, but this developmental image is important because it's sort of a means that enables us to get to the end, but somehow the end brings about or causes the means to be what it is. There's a sort of reciprocal element that comes to actualize itself that was there all along. So like, I don't know, the acorn becomes an oak tree, but there had to be some oak tree-ness that caused it to be that way. So even though it's the means for reaching that end, the end was already there all along. So too with being and knowing, I guess, the sort of means to get to the end had to be there, but there had to be this thing in order to get to it in the first place. Sort of like Sipho said at the beginning with
but okay. Sorry. Then this might be like an interesting. Then how do we account for the fact that at one stage is there development through time? Like at one stage, the means, and then we're saying there might be like a development or a change. What changes? So like there's a sense that there's something like there's an affordance of a really radical nature of to change or of change. And how do we like?
I hate to sort of draw Aristotle into this, but I think Hegel might have really liked Aristotle. The definition that Aristotle gives of I think it's an actuality or a nousia is a being itself staying the same. I can't remember. I think it's something like that. And it sort of is an unchanging change or a change that is what it is. It sort of is dynamic, and in changing it stays the same. It sort of has a nature that is self-changing or self-sameness. And so that development over time that you're trying to point to, I'm not sure, because there seems to be a sort of development over time, but there also seems to be a sort of inherently activity that's underlying and staying the same while it's changing.
So the natural assumption in philosophy. Okay. Well, or the goal of philosophy, the desire, the actual cognition of what truly is. That's the desire. What when he says it's the natural assumption that in philosophy, before we can start to deal with this proper subject matter, and then that actual cognition of what truly is he speaking? What philosophy is he speaking about? Is he speaking? Is he now is it a uh, uh, is he critiquing his like Kant and just like people in his like immediacy? Like what is
Yeah,
philosophy like?
that's the difficult part. That's why I asked about your historicization reading. Is he historically reading off these characters that naturally assume this, that are in his close surroundings? Or is this assumption natural because philosophy itself assumes it? So philosophy takes itself to be the case that we need to know our knowing. And this is exemplified perhaps most fruitfully in Kant. But I think what I'm trying to point to is that philosophy itself has a sort of self-development. And one of the stages that Hegel is pointing out is the stage of self-doubt, or the stage of sort of skepticism towards itself. And so the phenomenology of spirit, well, it's not the doing of philosophy because that's the logic of science, but in a sense, by letting the absolute come to be and sort of giving us knowledge, it's also a realization of philosophy. The, what I'm claiming that Hegel is claiming he's doing with this book is philosophy, is what I'm claiming is the radical claim that Hegel is making. And that the natural assumption is one moment in the development of philosophy. Or in philosophy.
Can't tell whether it's
would you,
development or it's sustainment. It's all starting to sound like the same thing. With everything I've listened to, it's all starting to sound like the same thing.
But get away, wait. But the I want to resist that saying that like coming into the like if that's occurring, we need to like go after it. The um Hadley, could you say more about the what you said about the doubt and skepticism? How what Hegel is proposing in philosophy as philosophy moves past that accumulated habit, and just the I'm loving how this is relevant to Sipho also in terms of just character and skepticalness, if I can put that.
So there's that immediacy that's sort of the taking of being to be true, and then that's like the first stage of philosophy, and historically that plays out with sort of, I guess, the ancients, the thing that is known as one or being or water or whatever you want to call it. That's the sort of thing that Hegel's pointing to when he's doing that. Ontology seems to be sort of the first stage in the development. Then the sort of skepticism that comes after that, that's exemplified by Kant and Descartes, is like, it was in my thesis at some point. I think I called it the teenagehood of philosophy. It's sort of like that stage where like you mature, so you have to doubt everything that your parents told you or whatever. All these people that have been telling me this stuff all my life. I need to start exercising my rational faculties for myself, and bring those rational faculties to bring the truth out. But then, like in your adulthood, and this is maybe me putting too much personal experience onto this, in your adulthood, in the fully matured, reasonable state, you sort of harmonize with the views that are true that were given to you historically. Like you have this ability now that you've tried to throw everything away, now that you've doubted everything, you come to see which things are undoubtable just by that process of doubting. And by attempting to doubt those things that were passed down to you, you come to sort of first principles. So too with the sort of Hegelian philosophy, what I understand him to be doing, how he moves past that skepticism, is that he begins to doubt the doubting. That taking of that taking of the separation of knowing and being that results from doubting, that's the fear of error. And he says that should we not mistrust this fear of error? Perhaps this fear of error is itself the error. Actually being scared of making mistakes, actually being skeptical is itself a form of mistake making. It's perhaps a necessary mistake to make. It's one of those things that we might have to do, and it might be in the very nature of us to make this mistake. That's why the assumption is. That's why I'm trying to push the naturality of the assumption. It's not just natural because it's convenient, or it's not just natural because there are people that have done it before. I want to say that it's natural in another sense.
Type of thing we do.
Yeah, I want to say that Hegel's also trying to point out that naturality, that it's a part of the unfolding of the being that knows itself, or that sort of a picture.
It's just what we do. It's just what we do.
You're okay. I think your again intuitive image thing. I think we want to I would love to really that assumption, like if we can just yeah.
I stick with it a little bit. I actually stopped before I should have.
Go
You
for
said
it.
you need to distinguish this. You want to avoid the sameness, or you want to try and turn us away from the sort of sameness that Sipho is positing. I think one of the ways of looking at it, right, is still through this developmental framework. Um, it's a natural assumption of philosophy and so on and so forth. So too, there are natural stages in our life. There's this sort of like teenagehood and rebellion and stuff. But to stick with those, to take those as what our life is supposed to be, is to make a sort of mistake. It's sort of to cut our own development short, like I almost did my speech there. It's to take ourselves to be complete when we're not. And so, what differentiates the sort of, or what I'm claiming that Hegel thinks differentiates his own philosophy from other philosophies, is that it's a full maturation of reason, or it's philosophy coming to be its final form. It's that sort of a thing. Whereas the philosophers that take there to be the separation, they're sort of doing something and they're sort of being to a certain degree, but in taking themselves to be, they sort of suppose themselves to be doing something other than they're doing. They're like stuck.
It seems like they always doing the same thing. I don't know.
I want to I think it's Hadley. I'm saying I think it's something similar, just in a It's like if that natural assumption, if we can appreciate its perhaps like its ontological, I'm gonna say a bunch of words that like its ontological status, or that it is continuous in reality, that it's like it's distributed and reiterating in a manner that's almost like a uh like the words like invisible come to mind, like the content that fills it out can completely contradict the subsequent way in which it manifests.
I think Hegel's word for it later on in the text is a shape. It's a shape.
Shape.
So like the shape looks a certain way, but it turns out that like once we free it from its contradiction, or once we fully develop the shape, it sort of turns on its head or changes itself in some weird way. It sort of becomes this like it like takes on many forms, but actually turns out to be one thing when we complete this. I don't know if that helps.
It did. I also I had a reply to interruptions. The
No, go for it.
so I'm not sure if it's content. I don't know if I'm looking at the right passage. I think it's 86, but let me read it. There was a sense of this ambiguity, and there's this movement that when it think I'm going in the right place. It's about halfway through. Consciousness knows something. This object is the essence or the in itself. But it is also for consciousness, the in itself. This is where the ambiguity of this truth enters. We see that consciousness now has two objects. One is the first in itself. The second is the being for consciousness of this in itself. The latter appears at first sight to be merely the reflection of consciousness into itself, what consciousness as a minor object. That ambiguity,
Yeah. So it's the ambiguity is an interesting one. It's sort of the in itself, insofar as I understand it, it's a moment of consciousness where one recognizes that the in itself is also an in itself for consciousness, and so it's not just in and for itself, but in and for another. So the thing in itself sort of becomes for another when it's recognized as the in itself for a consciousness.
That feels like the movement. It's the in itself, and then consciousness recognizes it's in itself for consciousness, and then now there's two objects. And now that in itself for consciousness becomes part of consciousness, and then now that's the thing that sees the in itself. And then that same
itself is called experience, I think, is what Hegel is trying to point out, is that this object sort of doubles itself, and this duplication is sort of experience. What it is to have an experience is to have this weird sort of doubling. There's this in itself that it appears to be by itself, and then it turns out to be for a consciousness. But as soon as it turns out to be for a consciousness, it is what it is in itself. So the appearance is the sort of self-representation of the in itself, or whatever. I don't know how to put it.
Yeah, you see, this is not. I'm having a hard time. In the sense that I don't see how it's still.
How what?
I don't see how it's still not for the sake of. Let me put it in the way that I understood it. Perhaps the way I understood it is the problem. Maybe I'm putting too much of how I look into it on the thing. So I'm viewing the entire thing, perception, reality. All right. So now, in other words, if let's say consciousness is the thing that helps me perceive reality, the means towards perceiving reality. Right? Now, when I want to perceive consciousness, I use consciousness. So it sounds like it's saying consciousness perceives itself, or consciousness for consciousness, but also consciousness for consciousness is also something else. There's something else, but sounded to me as if it was saying the issue with me trying to perceive my consciousness is that I am not perceiving my consciousness. I'm perceiving a perception of my consciousness. So I don't see how the consciousness is different from perceiving anything else. Like, how am I any certain of anything else I'm perceiving that what I'm receiving now is not a perception of the thing I used to perceive, rather a perception of the means instead of the means itself. I don't know if I'm making sense of that.
I think that the failing is the succeeding itself here. The moment when you notice that consciousness is itself, that consciousness is the thing that sort of perceives, and then when you try to look at consciousness itself, you realize that consciousness is only a perception. You don't get the consciousness itself, but you only get the perception. But the fact that you only get the perception points to an in itself, and that failure to get the in itself contains within itself both
in itself
and the perception. So consciousness
all right. All right,
Consciousness
now I
has
get.
weird self-reflexivity where it has both this aspect of in itselfness and being for another. So the for itself is the consciousness that exists apart, but the for another is the consciousness as perceived through consciousness. Consciousness has
All
this
right.
ability to accommodate difference within itself.
Yeah,
I think the fancy way of saying it is like the identity of identity and non-identity is the one that he thinks about, or something like that. There's a paragraph on it. I just can't find it right now, where he defines consciousness. If anybody can help me look for it, might be useful to talk about it.
sure. Just to the in terms of reflecting on our process with the text,
Yeah.
like should we read the introduction again?
I mean, we could. There's a lot here. I think the difficulty with these or any texts that we approach that are philosophically rich is the question of when do we move on?
Yeah.
I think it's either it'll be arbitrary or it'll be in the nature of the thing, and it's difficult to tell which one it is when we're doing it. Because as like someone who's studied Kant and written a thesis on Kant, there's so much material here to talk about. But as someone who's doing a reading group with you guys, that's not the stuff that's been interesting to me in this session. The stuff that's been interesting is the stuff that you guys have been putting forth as readings of this. And it's just this text is going to afford a multiplicity of readings. So to answer your question in a long and short version, I don't know. I don't know whether we should stick to the introduction. If you guys, I think if everybody feels as though they get the introduction, then there's no point in sticking with it. And we should sort of see how, if everybody's happy that we need to sort of see the self consummation of being and knowing, the sort of unity of being and knowing that is the phenomenology of spirit, then what we can do is move on to the next chapter, which I think is called sense certainty, because that's a sort of, I'm going to look at it now, Vida. That's a sort of a playing out in one area of the self development. I think what happens, again, I haven't read the rest of the book, but from what I can see, this super argument plays out through a bunch of separate arguments. So the argument is repeated again and again and again and again, but just in different variations and shapes.
Yeah. I'm happy to go on. I want to go through the introduction again though, so I will either way. I think that's the superstructure. I want to be more familiar with that.
The way that I would suggest you do that uh, is to take the argument step by step. Is to because that whole this is why I said it's not necessary to finish this introduction. Because the argument repeats itself everywhere. As far as I can see, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, that recurring thing is, yeah.
The first page is really where the moves happen. The first like up to 74 is the move that sort of repeats itself again and again. From what I can see, I just wanted to look for this. Here we go. I think it's part 82 of Ile, this definition of consciousness. The other definition of consciousness is the one that Dan gave. This contradiction and its removal will become more definite if we call to mind the abstract determinations of truth and knowledge as they occur in consciousness. Consciousness simultaneously distinguishes itself from something, and at the same time relates itself to it. Or as it is said, this something exists for consciousness, and this determinate aspect of this relating, or of the being of something for a consciousness, is knowing. But we distinguish this being for another from being in itself, and it is related to knowledge or knowing, is also distinguished from it and posited as existing outside of this relationship. This being in itself is called truth. It's not the definition that I was looking for, but it also is a move that pops up a bunch of times, and I can't remember what the definition of consciousness is. But consciousness has this peculiarity within itself to contain both what it is and sort of what it is not. It has this sort of double aspect to it where it has an identity that sort of can unify it with something that it is non-identical to. It accommodates this difference in it. That's why if you read Kant closely, one of the categories that comes up is negation. And negation is a form of difference. I don't know if that helps.
That negation came up is good. In the context of that movement, the consciousness knows something, and this object is the essence of the in itself, but is also for consciousness the in itself. So it's for that for consciousness, like
it's sort of maybe one
that's
way of
the
thinking, like a comportment, like consciousness knows something, and it's comported towards this being, and in being so comported, it's like turned towards this being in itself, and this being, by being the in itself, by being the type of thing that it is also for consciousness, because what it is for consciousness is the in itself. So once we recognize that it's not, it turns out to be both in itself and for another.
yeah. That's one that just won't, like, it's
Yeah, I don't know how to explain it either.
no, I'm with you. But it's similar to what we were touching on in virtue. It's like by being for yourself, you can benefit the other. And it's precisely when you are being for another that you might involve yourself in bringing harm to another for another's good. Like, yeah,
It's also important to notice that the thing that we're studying, the sort of phenomenal knowledge, the thing that comes on the scene, the thing that's under investigation, or the being that is being known, is itself a knowing. Or again, the knowing that is itself a form of being. So like there's that sort of duality to it, where the object that we're studying is knowledge, so the content and the thing being studied are the same. And so by being that sort of thing, it has a sort of existence to it. And by having that sort of existence, it is sort of knowable.
That's interesting. I don't know whether I'm just repeating what you say in other words, or I'm saying something like what you say. Because again, what's interesting is that it also seems that being and knowing occupies the same place insofar that by studying the object of means, we're using a means to study the object of means, and so it seems like we have turned the means into the object.
Yeah, the activity itself is the object of study. And so like another way of passing that out, I think, because I think it's the same way of passing things out, just in different forms, is that formulation of consciousness. Because consciousness contains within itself both the in itself and the for another. So consciousness is not really either the in itself or the being for another, but it's that relating. And that relating, or that relatedness, is itself the activity that is consciousness. Or again, that sort of thing is under its own. Yeah. So it's a sort of self-reflexive relationship that we're sort of interested in.
Look, if there's one thing we're sure, I'd like to take this moment, in this part of our video, to thank our sponsors. Water refreshing you day and night. Water. As I was saying, if there's one thing, if there's one thing we are sure of in this first meeting is we have a shitload to think about and to talk about, as seen from this introduction. This is a very interesting and thought-provoking. You can't tell whether you're coming or going, or coming and going is the same thing.
The
You
discombobulation.
really can't. Like, it seems to fit into everything, fit into nothing as well. It also, like the thing that's puzzling about it is, in a strange way, it seems the very things he's telling us we should stop doing, he seems telling us that we should do those same things. I don't know if I'm the only one who's getting that sense. Like, it seems that these assumptions he's saying we must stop. He's saying we must keep making assumptions. So I'm like, so this is why I brought up the implications of taking either Descartes, Hegel, or Kant's position. Like, because I'm interested to see if the outcome of any would be different. If the outcome of assuming each position would be different when you apply it to an object of study. Because if it is, it's different.
I think it can be different. I think that maybe I failed to bring out this difference, but maybe approaching the idea from a different angle will help do so. It's a similar issue to virtue or goodness that we were talking about the other day. No one can fail to have it. No one can fail to have being. No one can fail to have some form of perfection. No one can fail to sort of have it completely. You can't completely fail. And so too in philosophy, we can't completely fail to philosophize, perhaps because it's the nature of us to philosophize. So Kant and them, they aren't completely wrong, right? Like, they're not doing philosophy. They're at a stage in philosophy, and that's a sort of part of the development of philosophy. But they're not reaching the sort of stage that Hegel is proposing to reach, that sort of self-fulfillment. And so it's a complex relationship because no one gets it completely wrong. But there are ways of getting it wrong that make it clear when someone's gotten it right, I guess. Like the being that has virtue is to a higher degree. So too in philosophy, when we're doing philosophy properly, we are to a higher degree. We are the type of things that we are. And that's, I guess, one of the ways that you can see it. Perhaps one of the ways. I don't know. I'm just trying to make a suggestion here. It's perhaps that this text has an ability to stimulate philosophizing as an activity more so than any of those other texts. I'm not saying that Kant or Descartes can't enable the same sort of philosophizing, but I think that one of the ways, this is probably true for Hegel, but one of the ways that we can see it is the sort of stagnation that results from the sort of Cartesian or Kantian philosophy. They sort of get stuck, and we have people that, have stuck to this disunity between the subject and object. There are people that exist, even in philosophy departments, that disavow things like truth, like goodness, like being. There are people that think that we can't get to being, and for people like us, I guess, which is a terrible thing to say, who sort of had that experience of the being, the good or whatever, or that non-experience, that failure to experience, but knowing it's there, it seems weird. Like it seems like they stop just before they hit it. Every time we engage with an argument, we're always like, yeah, this guy's like, he's right, but then it turns out that he's wrong, and the sort of overthrowing happens, and it's that sort of that ability that is engendered. That this is also why I think that the Zoom thing should have been recorded and is being recorded, is that like what we're doing here is in a sense the same activity. This discussion, this ability to engage with it, identify sameness and difference, and make these distinctions and get sort of taken hold of by the truth is something that I think is happening in the phenomenology of spirit. It's sort of a self-consummation of the idea, or the fulfillment of the idea.
Mm-hmm. United in notion. Should I read the last passage?
Sure.
89. I don't know, for no other reason than it's the last one.
Yeah.
The experience of itself, which consciousness goes through, can, in accordance with its notion, comprehend nothing less than the entire system of consciousness, or the entire realm of the truth of spirit. For this reason, the moments of this truth are exhibited in their own proper determinateness, vis-a-vis as being not abstract moments, but as they are for consciousness, or as consciousness itself stands forth in its relation to them. Thus, the moments to the whole are patterns of consciousness. In pressing forward to its true existence, consciousness will arrive at a point at which it gets rid of its semblance of being burdened with something alien, with what is only for it, and some sort of other, at a point where appearance becomes identical with essence, so that its exposition will coincide at just this point with the authentic science of spirit. And finally, when consciousness itself grasps this its own essence, it will signify the nature of absolute knowledge itself. That seems quite exciting. Maybe that presence of the alien, or the error, or the thing lacking, or the thing other, like that might be a thing to repeatedly bring before ourselves. But just before you started recording, I was plagued by that sense this morning. Something other, like there's something, and it disturbed my peace. Yeah.
This interruption of your phenomenal experience by the sort of noumenal, I guess, is the way that you might want to put it in this context.
And there's something that it's like beyond. It's something. What is it? There's something about. Well, I don't know what I'm trying to say. Like, yeah, let me not say it.
It's something like, from what I understand it, it's the only way to succeed. The only way to succeed in capturing it is to fail. Is that sort of like, it's that recognition that it interrupts and it pops in, but then it sort of pops out again. It just disappears again, and in noticing that it's that sort of that failure to grasp it is itself the grasping, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the movement through. It's that because that sense of the failure to grasp is the sense of there being something other or alien, and then recognizing, like, that's a whatever that is, like, affords a movement, or so then you you try to grasp, and you keep trying, and then the thing that persists is the sense of how I'm failing, and then now this growing presence of an other, or like an alien in the attempt to, and then it's like that thing that is other somehow comes into and integrates with appearance, or with what is appearing, and then you're peaceful for a little bit until Hadley suggests we read the Phenomenology of the Spirit, and then you Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is not relevant to the phenomenology of the spirit, but it's the sense that I've been getting more and more as we've been having these discussions. That every now and then, sort of the nothingness rears its head, like that sort of abyssal figure pops up, and then like this, we run up against a wall, but that running up against a wall is part of the nature of that thing. It's to it's 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 like our inability to grasp it is that sort of grasping that's happening, that that sort of a thing, and that like it can't help but happen. There was something, I hate to intermingle the two things that we were doing, but there was something that also happened in the virtue sessions where we were talking about the sort of no one can fail to have it, and the sort of the ideal state and how people should interact in that state. But it seems to be that like we don't find ourselves in the ideal state. We're never in the ideal state. We never in connection with that thing, and that is part of the nature of what we are, is to somehow be fundamentally apart from that sort of a thing. And so in being that way, there's the sort of separation between us and the nothing that is there, or the being that is there that we just can't sort of get to. And yeah, it just seems like to me that that fundamental displacement, or that fundamental part of us to be in that non-ideal situation, um, when it comes to either knowing or being or goodness or something like that, seems
Yeah.
to be like exploring and taking seriously.
There are two ways that I can take that. The first is that it's there's almost like a sense of like a giving a giving up, or like as like a relinquishing to the fact of something always being other or incomplete. Or but then the thing that's revealing about that side is that that's in reference to an ideal. So that means that the incorporation of the incompleteness has not become the 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 fact or the ideal. It's still in reference to an ideal, and so is not what might be the authentic science of spirit. The Where finally, when consciousness itself grasps its own essence, it will signify the nature of absolute knowledge itself. That then the second way is that if consciousness's own essence is this other, um this in relationship within itself, that's other, um but isn't pining, or isn't, then you see the two different ways. Like it can be like, uh
Yeah, the one sort
that
of
that
lacks the thing, and then like is like it feels itself to be at a loss because it's apart from the thing that it's pining for, whereas the other one recognizes that its lack is a sort of that thing being with it already, and then is sort of
yeah,
fulfilled by that sort of a thing.
it or it is lacking that thing, or like it, but just playing with the expressing it. We seem to be in a similar notion. The notion's a word we haven't touched, but the um
The translation might be a bad translation there. I don't know. Notion is notion is a technical term that arises. It's like a concept that is purified. So it's a concept free from any reference to intuition. So the pure notion is something like uh, I or something like that. But I think Hegel maybe I think the German translation is literally Begriff, which is concept, and I think notion may be better translated as concept in this instance, uh, in this text. Apparently, it's one of the common criticisms of them in the translation.
I go, that's an easy remedy. Yeah.
What was the issue that you wanted to remedy?
No, that translation issue.
Yeah, apparently it's caused a lot of issues over the history of Hegel interpretation.
I'm glad people have struggled over it, and we are the beneficiaries of.
Yeah, occasionally it helps. Those who have come before us have helped deal with the problem, and that's part of the maturation, I guess, of Hegel interpretation.
Sure. Oh, this okay. Maybe it feels like we should be wrapping up, but this I want to then just like put in this image again of like the subject matter that we are on is like, or around, it's like it may be like so fundamentally constitutive of the nature of reality, like it's so it's um it might even be like how anything comes to be, or how things are, like regardless of it's hard to like. Okay, let me just leave that. Like another thing that we might do more of is to bring uh more of our persons into it, like to ground a lot of the ways that it begins to play out. Um, there'll be like a thing to gauge there in terms of how much you want to share, but I think that bringing it into um like the the specific lacks, or the yeah. So okay, as an experience this morning, this um no, that'll be indulgent. Yeah.
I think I do want to just revisit something before we end, and it's perhaps to go back to the beginning with what we started with, the question of can being be known. So we've gotten three formulations of it now, and I think the three formulations are instructive, or they tell us something about the text that's come to light of its own accord. And so when we started, we asked the question, can being be known? And we noticed a peculiarity that emphasized the knowing aspect. So it preferenced knowing over being. And it asked the question of whether being is the type of thing that can be known. Then we reiterated it in the second form, is being knowable? And that sort of preference, the sort of entity like character of being. Is it the character of being to be knowable? Is being something that is knowable? And now I want to come to the third formulation of the question, but you'll see in a moment why the third formulation is not really a question itself. The third formulation that I want to posit is knowing being, question mark, um, or being knowing, because that's the sort of position that we find ourselves in. We've got a sort of being that is knowing, or a sort of knowing that is, and that's what the object that the investigation is going to put under scrutiny. Um, the question itself falls apart because the question seems to presuppose that differentiation that is antithetical to the type of philosophy that Hegel suggests that the phenomenology of spirit will end in the consummation of.
I think that question is a good guide. So let me just get the difference. The first one is that the question is emphasizing knowledge in terms of its capacity to capture being. The second one is emphasizing being in terms of its availability to knowledge. If being is something that can be known. Or did I just say number one again?
I think that's closer to the first formulation. Um, so the sort of the availability is preferencing knowledge. So if being is available to
Okay.
knowing, then knowing becomes preferential. But whether being affords a knowability or it is part of the character of being to be knowable. That's the sort of
Being or being knows or like being whether being is the knower or like the
I think
you could yeah
yeah, the second one is all three formulations are failures, and we
yeah
have to articulate them in order to be good at what we're doing. But yeah, the second one is sort of from what I understand myself to be saying, the um, being affords a knowability, so it emphasizes the being or the entityness rather than the knowing. It still keeps the two separate. Is being knowable still keeps the two separate. It just sort of asks if there's a character or a thing, and if that thing has the character of being knowable,
Wait,
that's what it is. But when we come to the third formulation, we drop the second thing, and then we get the sort of being knowable, which is it's there in the second formulation, but it's not as explicit as it is in the third formulation, I think.
being
If I'm
knowable, yeah.
understanding, so if I'm understanding you correctly, if being is if being is object and the person looking at the subject, the first one that says can being be known emphasizes more on the subject's capacity to know, and then the second one that says is being known emphasizes more on the object that is being having the capacity to know. The third one basically says knowing, knowing and being is the same. To know is
Yeah, knowing is the knowledge as an entity, or being knowing is a sort of um, an entity that is a knowledge.
yeah, it goes back to that truth. First to know something is to be. Yeah, I get it.
But yeah,
I can't wait to see where this goes.
noticing that inability to formulate it clearly is also important, because I think why we're unable to formulate it clearly is because whenever, like, similarly in that subject object, in the terms of the subject that looks to the object, and there's that distinction, that sort of subject and predicate line that runs through language, is much similar to that. So if the object of the sentence is being, and the subject of the sentence is the knower, then we privilege the knower. If the other way around, then we privilege the being. But really, what we want to privilege is that relationship thing that's happening.
Because the subject is the being and object is subject is yes.
Yeah.
This Trinity we can contemplate for eternity. So we all good.
People, as I'm sure people have, people have before us. So that's interesting.
So,
Very interesting. It's very different, but also in the sense it's very much like the things we always look into. The non-being, being, becoming. Yeah, I guess it's the approach to it now. It's where let's look at
yeah,
this non-being, becoming in a different.
I'm looking forward to this developmental sense. I found myself ending up gesturing a lot to like embodied sense perception and trying to communicate it. And just like one page into the first thing on sense consciousness kind of remedied me of that. So
Maybe we can talk about that next time. Maybe that should be the sort of the through line or the in for the next session.
true. Sweet.
Are you pointing to sort of why we shouldn't use the embodied gestured sort of stuff to understand this, or why we should?
It's that I had been expecting communication to happen when I was just like in essence being like this. I'm like trying to communicate my immediate sense perception and thinking that that's going to be uh, uh or sense consciousness and that's going to be conveyed. Which is like a lot of the work that I was doing, like teaching people movements and breathing. It's like, so it's interesting how you cue that kind of thing. And then when I got into discussions outside of that context, I'd try to refer back to the body or to like embodied experience. And then it gets weird. It's like strange. It's like it
Say more about
shouldn't
that weirdness, if you can.
say more about.
The weirdness, if you can. What's the weirdness? How does it get weird?
On the on the one hand, it's like it can privatize in a way that's not uh commune commune inducing. So it's not a movement of like communing. Then it's also like in a less like serious sense, it's like this kind of, when people speak about their their pains or like something that's like sore or something. It's like there's something I like, maybe I haven't tried hard enough to put my finger on it, but there's something like a little bit irritating about it. It's like there's like a um yeah, I don't know what it is,
I
but
think
I've just, yeah.
I think that the embodiment aspect is important in Hegel. I'm not sure why I think this. I have no evidence for it yet. But I mean, when we look at the perceptual problem that epistemology proposes, there seems to be a sort of presupposition of a division between the mind and the body or something like that. And in each case, it seems to work itself out differently. So like Descartes has that sort of mind-body separation, and God is sort of the bridge between spirit and between mind and body or something like that. And it's what makes our ideas conform to it. Spinoza is kind of an interesting, weird case where like he's got this parallelism between mind and body. Mind and body are both ideas of God, and they just sort of run along different timelines or something. If you want to talk about that, but if Hegel has to do what I think he's doing, he's not going to be able to split embodiment from mentality in the same way. I think if he does that,
Yeah. Uh,
which is
I,
weird for
I,
someone that's regarded as such a conceptual thinker.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it might be a similar like this if I say this and that's meant to be communicative, it's like there's a problem. I think it's a similar resistance I was having to like if we keep reiterating or recurring an abstracted structure of what we take to be going on, we might be missing something in the fact of that recurrence. Like like it the structure needs to apply to its manner of uh to the historicized way in which it's unfolded and in which we have inherited it. So there seems to be levels of application that
Yeah, I think I might be skipping ahead. I'm not sure. I haven't read the section on sense certainty in a long time, and I'll be doing it next time. But
uh,
maybe just ahead. What I understand I'm doing is like when people point at sense certainty as the most immediate form of certainty, or it is certain, um, and it's because we're in a sort of immediate relationship to it. The senses sort of apprehend things, and then we get knowledge of these things through experiencing them. But when we point to these things and we say this rock or this heat, then there's a sort of the thisness is weird because it attempts to point at a particular, but in doing so refers to a universality that's already there. This isn't any particular thing. And so maybe that adds to why you feel that way about your embodied talks with people and stuff like that, or they talk about pains. Because as soon as they point to that thing, it ceases to be what they're pointing to. Sort of runs away from it.
Yeah.
From what I remember of that section, I don't remember much, but basically there's a sort of universality and particularity that's going on. The two sort of blend together in this weird way. How they do that and why that's interesting is, I guess, a different topic.
Yeah. The thisness.
Yeah. Whatever that is.
Should we call it there?
I think so.
Okay, lekker. Ish.